Okay, so we're now recording for those of you unable to join us for the fantastic evening of entertainment and laughs. I am very delighted to be able to introduce you a good friend and a esteemed leader in our community, Rich Margerum. And I didn't prepare a bio for you, Rich, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I'm just really excited to hear what he has to say about watershed councils and how those, you were talking about, we just had the chance to sort of chew this over yesterday, how watershed councils illustrate one way in which public participation and public-private partnerships can achieve better outcomes with public resources in our community. And there's sort of a broader discussion there that if people are interested, we can go there, because that's certainly related to Rich's expertise and lifelong work as well. So the watershed councils are really just a case study in a way for a larger set of work which is been involved in. So over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see everyone this evening. Everyone can be okay there? Great to talk about watershed councils. I give you a little highlight here is I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy and Planning at the U of O, also Associate Dean in the College of Design. Okay, right, Associate Dean in the College of Design. My research around this has spanned a number of years. I first started doing work around this in Wisconsin. I spent a number of years in Australia doing this, and I've now been in Oregon 20 years looking at these kinds of collaborative governance problems, with Oregon Watershed Councils being one of them. I'm also what's often referred to as a Pracademic, so I have 1 foot in academia and 1 foot in practice. So I've worked as an environmental specialist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I served on the board of the Longtime Watershed Council, was actually board chair at one point. And I'm currently on the board of the Oregon Network of Watershed Councils as well to support statewide groups. Written several books on this subject, written about 30 or 40 articles on the subject as well. I don't tell you that to impress you, but to say how hard it is for me to think about summarizing this work in like 20 minutes. So what I thought I'd do is give you some kind of high level sort of themes and ideas about what watershed councils are, what they do. And I thought the best way to do that was to give some examples of the actual work that they do, and then talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that they face. And I can open up for questions then, and you can delve into what aspects you find most interesting.
Right. I wanted to highlight one of the things I thought was cool about Rich's topic tonight is it relates to the stream team. So I just want to make sure that connection is explicit to everybody. The stream team, watershed council. Yeah.
And just so you know, the Amazon Creek is part of the Longtime Watershed. So if you live in the Amazon Creek catchment, you are a potential member of the Longtime Watershed Council. You show up at a meeting, you have the opportunity to vote on whatever they're doing at their particular meeting. So Oregon Watershed Councils, they emerged in the 1990s, part of both a nationwide and a statewide movement to try and address concerns about water quality. So the legislative background, if you're interested in this, is probably the Clean Water Act, which is the goal is to have fishable and swimmable waters in the United States. A lot of people think of the Clean Water Act, they think of regulations. So like discharge from factories, from sewage treatment plants, but a big part of the Clean Water Act is about controlling and reducing non-point source pollution. So all the stuff that we put in our yards that flow into the local creeks, all the stuff that runs off agricultural fields, builds up nutrients, sediments, and heat into the water system that affect species. Now in the Northwest, we have another layer that's a really critical issue, which is the Endangered Species Act. We have critical species of salmon and trout. That are very sensitive to nutrient and very sensitive to temperature. And so this is another big driving factor. A lot of our ecosystems are dependent on these species of trout and salmon for a variety of things. And of course, we've greatly altered these watersheds and affected their habitat. So watershed councils are voluntary and they're non-regulatory. So they don't get involved in permitting and regulation activities. Their goal is really to help restore and enhance the watershed through a variety of voluntary actions with a whole range of partners. They're formed locally, so the state didn't sit down and map them out and say, here's what the watershed councils are going to be. They were formed locally, and then they had to be approved by the county commissioners in their area. And so when I show you a map of it, you'll see why it's kind of complicated to describe what they are and how they operate. They are state supported, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And they're also meant to have inclusive representation of the range of interests in that watershed. So it is not meant to be an advocacy group for a particular point of view, but it's trying to bring all the affected and potential stakeholders together to try and work towards common ground of restoring these habitats. So a couple other quick facts. There are, depending on how you count them, about 70 odd councils across the state. About 58 of them receive state support, state funding. The one big source of funding is what they call operating capacity grants. So this is basically this funding to keep the operations going. So basically paying for office staff, for travel, for a staff person to do all that work to keep the organization running. The bigger chunk of funding comes from what's called project funding. And there's about 8 different kinds of project funding sources. So I'm not going to go into those details, but that's for doing a specific project in a specific property or part of the watershed. I'll give you some examples of those in just a moment. They're funded by lottery dollars and other state dollars, and those lottery dollars are enshrined in the state constitution. So there's been 2 public measures that have passed that make those lottery dollars permanently allocated to state parks and to watershed health. So the good news is they have a long-term stable source of funding. The bad news is it's not a huge amount of funding to do all the work they need to do. Yeah.
Just to make a difference.
Yeah.
Lottery, not worship, right?
Yes, right. Lottery, yes. So, but they've got Rotary funds as well. And then there's also some federal funds for salmon recovery that get passed through the state, and they allocate it out to these councils. So this is a map of Oregon's watershed councils. And again, it's complicated, and I didn't realize this would be such a small screen because it's hard to see. But as you see, most of the state is covered in some form of a watershed council. There are gaps there, and the gaps are there because there was no group that emerged that formed. So again, the state didn't say, here's where the councils should be, here's the size of them, and here's how they should operate. There's kind of a joke among researchers, which is if you've seen one watershed council, you've seen one watershed council, because they're very diverse in their structure, format, organization, and that ranges from size. You've got Harney County Watershed Council, which is probably the size of about a dozen states on the East Coast. North Fork, John Day, I was just talking with one of their coordinators. He's based in the city of 173 people. Nearest big city is John Day, that's 45 miles away. And biggest, 3.5 hours from Bend. His council covers an area 3 times the size of Connecticut. So some of these areas are extremely rural, extremely sparsely populated.
Is there a color on the map of what isn't in a council?
It's really hard to see. I'll sit here and make a cursor, but those slash lines, there's a few gaps are areas that are not covered. Yep, but not, but most of it's covered in that area.
So have we, if you wanted to start a watershed council in one of those slashed out places, is that possible now, or did they miss their chance? Oh,
No,
okay.
you could still do it. You would have to, get approval from local county commissioners, and then, go through that process, and you have to follow the state steps for forming a watershed council. Then you become eligible for funding. Doesn't mean you get funding, because remember, there's 70 plus councils, and there's only 58 that get funding. There's a number of councils that have actually banded together, and they've got a cooperative. They may have a bunch of volunteer-run groups and one coordinator, or because of they're quite small in size, or they're geographically don't cover much territory.
Sounds like you're planning, dude.
I just was wondering if there's if it happened at a certain time and now it can happen again, or if it's always available to people.
Well, a couple of examples, like Longtown Watershed Council formed as the Lower Longtown Watershed Council. A group of agricultural landowners came together. They went to the Lane County Commissioners. Lane County Commissioners said, no, you're not forming a Lower Longtown. You are forming a Longtown. Go back and get the rest of the watershed involved. So those groups went back and reached out and basically broadened it to make a Longtown Watershed Council. Other groups, you'll see really small councils. So their county said, yeah, sure, form that. But some of them have difficulty actually maintaining their operations because they're so small. But Longtown, actually a couple of local examples are really interesting ones to look at. So Longtown is 95% public land, private land. So almost all of their work is working with private landowners. They're a very community-based organization, very grassroots, And a lot of their work over the years has been directly with private landowners. Mackenzie Watershed Council, just up the river, that was formed by Eugene Water and Electricity Board. I shouldn't say formed, but they were sort of the initiators behind it. So EWEB, Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Forest Service were the drivers to kind of get that council off the ground. That's like 85% public land. And so they do a lot of projects in collaboration with the Watershed Council and the crosses into public land, some major restoration work in that area. So just locally, that's an example of two different councils have very different kind of structures and funding sources and partnerships along the way too. And I was looking up today, I couldn't find a good number of what the total state support is, but it's roughly maybe $70 to $80 million a year from those various sources. I think that's primarily the lottery dollars. I couldn't parse out was if any of that money is actually the federal pass-through funding. So this gives you a sense of that, the scale of these groups and how they operate. So I guess the best way to describe these groups and sort of illustrate is to give you some examples to kind of show what they do and sort of give a sense of their projects. So Long-Term Council, near to my heart, been involved with them for a long time. Again, Amazon is part of Long-Term River Watershed. This was an example, it's quite old, but it was a good photo series that I have that sort of shows a restoration project. So this was the landowner that had a small cattle property. The problem was that there was not a good way for cattle to access water. So the cattle were wandering into the stream to get water. Not good for a stream to have cattle standing in the water feeding and children. Not great for the cattle either, because it's, there's risks and dangers associated with that. So they were struggling with that. Council went out, did some assessment of that property, worked with the landowner, and what they did was basically agreed to do this restoration project that fenced off the riparian area. They went in, had a group of like 10 or 20 volunteers that removed all of the invasive species there. There were some old growth blackberries there that were like, 6 inches thick. So they went in there, removed those blackberries, went in, treated it, planted native species, fenced it off. And you might notice in that lower photo, a small, basically motor operated pump, and then extracts water from that creek and provides an off watering source for that landowner. So a classic win-win scenario. Landowner gets a safer, more sound watering source of their cattle. We get the cattle out of the stream. You've got riparian zone that's been restored and enhanced. And again, this is something that has to be maintained for a couple of years, but over time, you can see over a 5-year period, it really has become a more vital riparian zone. Yeah.
It appears that these watershed concepts don't have any regulatory power.
Correct. Yeah.
So they're just there to support the landowners, public or private, on different projects.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of key things they do besides doing the actual work is somebody's got to design these projects, right? So especially if you're doing anything in stream, there are risks of doing anything in stream, and there's also permits. So the council will get all the permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and do all that work. They'll do all the engineering and design, or they'll contract it out. They'll even find the contractors if there's any work to be done in the stream. And then the landowner is usually providing in-kind support. So it might be material, it might be labor. I think this project involved a conservation easement. So they set aside that land permanently. They also get a tax break for that as well. So again, they piece all those different pots of funding together to make a project like this work. So this is a good example of work on private land. Oh, in this group, they did a really nice job with what they call a sub-watershed program. So they get a landowner like this to do a project, and they say, hey, will you host a buffet at your house and invite all your neighbors to come over? The neighbors all come over, they get to show off their project, they get to meet the Watershed Council staff, and they get to hear about like all the benefits they got from it. And what that can often happen is then now all of a sudden you get neighbors who are then signing up for projects, and now you get a concentration of projects and a whole sub-watershed, and now you can begin really showing real benefits in terms of habitat improvement and water quality improvement. Yeah.
Did that landowner already have water rights to the long-term?
Yeah. They basically had access to rights there as well. So yeah, that would be an issue as well. If you're taking water out of the stream, you'd have to have make sure you have water permit to take those water rights out.
Does the property owner have to pay for any of the work that was done, or how does that work?
Most of the grants require some sort of what we call a cost share. So the cost share can just be labor. So they can maybe go in with their equipment and do slashing to start the project. They might provide fencing materials, or they can provide work hours, or they can provide the actual land that we're setting aside for conservation easement. So it's this is where it gets really complicated, and I don't actually know some, but different kinds of projects have different kinds of cost share requirements. Some of them they score better the more cost share you have. So the more you can get commitment, the more volunteer hours you can plug into it, then the better the rating is, and that often gets you approved.
Yeah.
We estimated that for every dollar spent by the state of Oregon through Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, it's generating between $8 and $10 of non-state support, either in kind, federal match, or other sources of funding. It's a really, really rough number, but it gives you a sense of that scale. So this is kind of a grassroots example. Here's one at the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a really exciting and neat partnership in the Rogue River Basin. Involves about 12 different watershed councils, soil and water conservation districts, private power companies, Army Corps of Engineers, Oregon Water Watch is taking a lead on this. This has been a 20-year project. They're have removed actually 4 dams in the lower road that's opened up something like 100 miles of river to fish passage along that entire water course. This is removal of one of them. This is a 39-foot high Savage Rapids Dam. This is showing before and after pictures. This is a dam that was no longer producing any power. I'm not sure when it was built, but it was serving as a barrier to fish migrating up and down that river. Now it's a free-flowing water course, open for rafting, and more importantly, open for fish. If you don't know, salmon and trout in Oregon are anadromous fish, so they migrate all the way up into the water courses, and they come back out. They're anadromous, which means they go from freshwater to saltwater. Anadromous, yeah. So they spend part of their life out in the ocean, and then they go up and they spawn. And some of the species actually will spawn up in the upper reaches of rivers, and they actually die after they spawn. And then that is the next generation of fish that come down. They actually know exactly which spot to go to, and they actually can smell where to go, and they want to return to that same spot through generations. And that's why you may think it's crazy that in the Snake River they actually catch the fish in trucks and truck them up the river. It's because they are geolocated to those actual spots. And if you ever get a chance, there's some neat rivers on the coast that are still free-flowing rivers. And you can go up there during spring Chinook or fall Chinook seasons, and you can see, 10-foot fish. Some are dying in the water, but they're working their way up to.
I was gonna say, on the McKinsey, you can see that too.
Yeah, right. So these are some of their current projects. So they've done 110 fish passage improvement projects since 1995. Some of them are these big projects. Some of these are removing old low-head push-up dams or low-head hydro dams that have been abandoned 100 years ago. But all those are serving as barriers to and that improves all that habitat.
Does this include also making fish ladders, or is that not something that you guys subscribe to?
Most of them, if it's the fish ladder, it's probably a power company that's installing that. But in many of these cases, the dams are either no longer. It's like an old car. It's like past its use by date. It's more cost to actually repair it or enhance it than it is to just take it out. And same thing, you've heard about the Klamath Basin. That's what's going on in the Klamath Basin. Power companies looked at the cost benefit analysis. They said, this is more expensive to replace. It's cheaper to take it out, especially if the federal government then helps subsidize it and remove some of those barriers there. So this is one I don't know as much about, but I thought this was a neat project to illustrate a couple of things. This is a Smith River Watershed Council near the coast. This is a partnership between the Bureau of Land Management, which is what BLM stands for here, partnership with the Umpqua Rivers, and a whole list of other partners. As you can see, there's a ton of work that they've done in this watershed over a 20-year period. Ironically, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the idea was take stuff out of the river and make it nice, free-flowing river. Well, that's terrible for fish because they like nice eddies and slow river to kind of find refuge. And so for years, they were taking rocks and logs out of the river. now we're putting them all back in again. So one of those classic, hindsight's 2020 stories. But what you see here in this sub-watershed is really a patchwork quilt of land. This is very typical of land in Oregon. You've got Bureau of Land Management land, you've got Forest Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs holding land on behalf of tribal partners, and then you've got white land, which is private land in the color white. And so what they've been doing over really a 20-year period is really a sustained, focused effort around restoring and enhancing that watershed. The neat thing about this watershed is they've got 60 years of monitoring data that they were doing even prior to this. So for a long time, there's a big steep decline in the fisheries there. What you've seen these past 20 years is now this neat upward trajectory showing real recovery of those fish species there. So it's just hard data to come by because this is, it took us 200 years to kind of mess up a lot of these watersheds, and we're not going to fix them in 5. These are long-term projects, and often voters or legislators want to know, like, well, is it better? And it's really hard to show sometimes with data that yes, there's improvement. But here's a good example of a watershed that showed real improvement.
Good question.
Yeah.
So, how the fires, the McKinsey affected? Yeah. How has the fires up the McKinsey affected your projects or your?
Yeah, I don't know specifically. It certainly had a big impact, and actually, the McKinsey Watershed Council and McKinsey Trust both pivoted to do a whole bunch of work around fire recovery because their concern was that all of that fire debris was going to go wash right into the river, and the big concern was any of those houses and buildings and structures. There could be all kinds of toxic materials. So EWEB, McKinsey River Trust, McKinsey Watershed Council, they got some emergency funds. They went out and did a whole sort of free debris removal just because they didn't want all that stuff washing in the watershed. So that was one of the things they did right away. I can't really speak to the long-term impacts, but that there's a big loss of forest cover up there, which is mean that there's more sunlight shining on that water course, which means it's going to heat up in temperatures. Anywhere there's an impoundment, any kind of impoundment acts as a sort of frying pan in summertime. It just holds and retains water that heats it up. So that's all going to affect it for a long time. But I can't tell you exactly what sort of direct impacts there have been. So let's wrap up here, and I'll continue to take questions. But show some of the strengths and challenges. So one of the strengths of these groups is this is a long-term sustained effort. These groups have been around 20, 25 years, depending on the age of these groups. And as you see, these projects take time to happen. I think I've actually put this in a couple of articles and no one's refuted it yet, but I think this is the longest example of a state watershed program in existence in the United States. So there are watershed groups that have been around longer, but in terms of a statewide program that's been sustained in this form for this long period of time, this is one of the few examples of programs that have been maintained. And the program I worked for in Wisconsin back in the 90s, it's gone. They changed it 3 times, and then the new governor came in and cut the whole thing. So, and that's the reason this is important is because they have a really vital network of people and trust with all these different partners. So they have community trust. They have all these community connections, and they have all these agency connections. So that agencies feel comfortable knowing that if they've got some restoration dollars and they need to get that dollars, out the door, they can turn to the Watershed Council. The council has got projects lined up. They've got maybe the engineering work already done, or the technical work already done on it, and they can get those projects delivered. And they've got landowners that they've been working with to do that kind of work. So it's really, really a great connection for agencies as well, because as they say in a lot of rural Oregon, the worst thing you can hear is somebody coming into your property and saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. But usually we'll bring out the shotgun. But these watershed councils are community-based organizations. They've got members in their council who are involved in local groups, or Rotary Club, or agricultural association, whatever it might be. So they're connected into that community, and they're a sort of a trusted partner that gives them an inroad into those areas. The challenges, though, a lot of challenges. One of the biggest concerns I have is around turnover and vulnerability. Just wrapping up a study in collaboration with Oregon State University, funded by OWEB, looking at how these groups can be sustained over time and how they can be nurtured and supported. I'm actually not paid on this project because I've also got sort of a dual role. I'm participating as a researcher, but I'm also on the board of Network of Watershed Councils, where we're seeing the same kind of concern. The concern is that some of these groups are like a one-person operation, like the John Day. It's a 1.0 FTE, and then they contract out a whole bunch of workers in the summer to do their work, and then they're back to one person. That's great when you got that one person, but some of these coordinators burn out. Some of them have been at a job 10, 15, 18 years, and it's time to retire or move on. And you can imagine all those networks and trust and relationships that are broken when a coordinator leaves. Or you've got a board where you have a turnover in the board. Sometimes the turnover can be helpful. You get new energy, new life into it. But sometimes you lose these long-serving board members and you lose all those community connections, and suddenly you're in jeopardy. And all of a sudden, council that's very strong could suddenly miss a grant cycle and suddenly be without staff. And that's a real concern. What's even more of a concern to me is there are a few councils that had 3 or 4 or 5 staff personally that gone through some hiccups and transition changes that suddenly were in danger of being not disbanded, but defunded. And that's even more of a surprise that some of these groups that you thought were like, here's a group that's won an international award, do this fantastic work, and all of a sudden a couple turnover in their board, a couple turnover in their staff, and all of a sudden they're in danger of being collapsing as an organization. So that's one big concern I have. And there's also a lot of just organizational challenges. A lot of these staff were hired as ologists, so they're scientists, and now all of a sudden they're not just trying to restore the watershed, but they're trying to run a board, trying to run a nonprofit, trying to fundraise, trying to recruit new members, and so forth. So the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, we've been doing a lot of work on helping them bring in expertise. We do webinars, like monthly webinars, and oftentimes it's focused on nonprofit management, grant writing, resource development, fundraising, board governance, because that's the part of the job that they struggle with the most is how do I restore a watershed, and run this nonprofit organization on the side. And then finally, diversifying funding is another big challenge as well. Some groups are very dependent just on state funding for their support. And a lot of it is locational. I'll be happy to talk about some of those locational challenges. Other groups are more in areas where there's more resources available, because they're in the Columbia River Basin, or they're in the coastal coho salmon areas, and there's more dollars available. But some places they're 100% dependent on state funding. And that's always a worry that when you're dependent on one source of funding. So they're doing a lot of work to diversify that. They're trying to go to foundations for additional support, work with community organizations, work with corporate partners and so forth. That's also a concern in a lot of these areas as well. So that is a really quick overview. And I thought I'd just try and get an overview, and then happy to dive into questions in more detail.
That's like people ask, we have another one.
So to get on the board, it doesn't look like there's any election or anything like that. Is there people showing up kind of like a Rotary Club and wanting to become members? Is that how it works?
There are certain rules. So there's basically they're formed as an association under Oregon state statute. I remember the exact statute. And then yes, in some of these groups, basically they have to have a process for open call for membership or board members. They then had to then go to the local county, whatever county they're located in, and seek approval from the county administrators. If they followed all those rules and could demonstrate that it was an open process. Oh, they also have to have a sort of representation of interest, which is a really squishy idea. But the idea, again, is not meant to be an advocacy group, but it's thinking about what are the communities you're trying to work with, and therefore, reach out to those communities and engage them. Go through all those steps, you get approved by the county commissioners, then you become certified, then you get certified by the state, you are considered a watershed council. That does not mean you get funding done. So that's the next step, is you get certified doesn't mean that you would get funding.
Once the council is established,
yep.
How do you deal with turnover at that point? You just go out and find friends and things like that?
Well, I mean, example, a long time when I was on the board, we were not a nonprofit organization. We had 2 staff, 2.0 FT, and a few contractors. We decided we needed to become a nonprofit because we needed more to diversify our funding. There's nothing to chase your volunteers away faster than to spend 6 months on articles of incorporation, bylaws, HR policies. Like nobody wants to do that, right? They want to get in, and restore the watershed. So it was kind of a lean time at that time, but we got through it. We became a nonprofit, and a few years later, and to be honest, they had some really great board members after that. They had a retired banker or some other folks that did a whole bunch of financial work for them. They had a major fund from the Ford Family Foundation to do a bunch of outreach effort, and they're now a staff of like 8.0 FTE, doing all kinds of stuff in urban areas as well as rural areas. So some of these groups have grown over time and are really quite robust organizations, but some of them have been and probably always will be a 1.0 or less organization. Oh, I should also mention that some of these really tiny groups, OWEB, which is the agency that oversees this group, recognize that they can't fund all these groups. And so they did provide incentives for some of these groups to band together, and then maybe have one coordinator that serves like 5 different community-based groups and support them. That's worked well in a few places, and a few places that's not worked well because it's complicated.
There is a saying that water is life.
Yep.
But most of us don't take that serious until when a catastrophe hits. What if you were to shut our water for 10 minutes before something went wrong in the anchor room? Or what if there was a drought? We all wake up and split. But I think most of the challenges related with watershed is human. How much you put in or invest into education with the community? Then number 2, partnership with community, and number 3, support.
Yeah, the education piece is something that councils would actually like to do more of. Unfortunately, a number of years ago, when they were trying to deal with declining dollars, lottery dollars, and other sources, they decided they were going to cut education grants. And so a lot of councils were very active in working with local schools and other kinds of districts, doing all kinds of citizen-based monitoring, citizen-based watershed stuff. Unfortunately, some of that has been cut, but some of it still continues through the volunteer effort. So a lot of councils are engaging communities in the volunteer effort. And so they're getting out to do a project on the ground, planting, restoration work, and that actually serves as a really key education piece. But you're right, most of the impacts are coming from human-based activities. And so, but this is, a lot of this is long-term impacts. We've built dams, we've channelized, we've removed debris, we've got runoff. And so it's sort of a long picture in terms of how we actually restore some of those areas and we can enhance.
So are there areas of the state where there may be some backlash about what kind of, because we have a very diverse state politically. I am not going to delve into that. Everybody knows what we're talking about. And so I'm just wondering how people cope with that or how that works, because to me, everything you're talking about sounds fabulous and something I would support. But I'm sure there are some people who don't feel that way.
No, I think that's a really good point. And in the sort of collaborative governance sphere, what we often talk about as a key is a common problem. And so when people can focus on a common problem, sometimes the politics doesn't get in the way of things. If we're trying to talk about a common policy, then yeah, we lost it. When I was serving a long-time board, I think they still have this kind of membership seats on the board. They've got sort of seats for organic farmers, for traditional farmers, pesticide companies, Oregon Country Fair, rural residential landowners, Christmas tree farmers, and so forth. So it is the whole spectrum and the whole gamut. So we had a rule: we never talk politics at that around the table, and we often joke that we all cancel each other out of the election.
Yeah.
But we can agree that there's a water quality concern, and that we all agree that that's something we want to address. And as always, sometimes you thought the old crusty farmer who was just there to protect things and prevent things from happening. He would tell this wistful story about growing up in Long Common fishing as a kid, and he doesn't see as many fish in there as he does today. he wants to be able to see his grandchildren, fish there as well. You hear that over and over again. It's some really incredibly dedicated volunteers in some of these watershed councils. And in some places, population 130, there's not many people to gather from in terms of populating these groups as well. So some of them are just really, really dedicated souls.
How has climate change altered your priorities, your reasons for going?
It is a big concern from a number of issues. I mean, in particular, trout and salmon are temperature sensitive species. That's the biggest limiting factor for a lot of trout and salmon habitat. So that means that any kind of water course that is exposed to more heat and sunlight, that means temperatures are going to increase, and you're going to see potential fish kills or distress to the fish and reduced productivity. So the whole controversy around the Klamath, one of the reasons why the dams are so difficult is not just because they're barriers, but because they're backing up water, and that's heating up that water source. And then and then when that water gets released, if it's not released from the right level of the dam, it's releasing water that's either too cold because it's coming from the bottom, it has no oxygen, or you're releasing from the top and it's too hot, or it's got too many nutrients, or you're trying to mix it in the middle. And so, by the time you're trying to do all that, it's really not cost effective to even keep the dam there anymore. So but it is a big issue. It's also, of course, an issue with the salmon as they spend their life in the ocean. We don't know exactly, where they're going, what some of the impacts are having out there. So we might be doing a great job of restoring some of these watersheds, but if they're not surviving out in the ocean, they're not going to come back to spawn in those areas. So yeah, there's big concerns there.
Chris, you've got time for one more question.
Sure.
Jim.
So having been on the member of a number of boards in my life, continuity of vision seems to be a problem. Too often, political issues which are not germane to the issue we are addressing get in the way of what's really happening. Boards change their bylaws to affect what's happening, and we end up making arguments that have no effect on what we're really doing, but they get in the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's often talked about in these groups. It's about mission creep. And so a lot of boards have to remain focused on our goal is to restore the water quality and watershed health, and that's our focus. And that sometimes puts them in a challenge with groups. There's like, we want you to take a stance on this particular project, which has a political decision to it. And a lot of councils have said, no, we're not going to do that. That's not good for our long-term interests. We're going to focus on watershed health. So that sometimes gets people upset because they feel like a project is detrimental to the watershed, but it's ultimately a decision that's out of the hand of the watershed council. It's the county or the state, whoever else is the decision-making body, and so they have to focus on that restoration effort. So yeah.
Great, Rich. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and jump to a little bit of business that we've got.